When were you in the Swedish Army?
He was drafted in the late summer of 1965. At that time, all Swedish draftees, they served only 10 months. And I ended up in a combat platoon that was part of a combat engineering regiment. And that's where I served my 10 months. And I was discharged around April 1966.
So you're in the Swedish Army, drafted, you
Yep.
served 1965, 66 for 10 months. And then when do you enlist in the US Marine Corps?
Enlisted in the Marines in mid-June 1967.
Mid-June 67. So get us from that soldier in Sweden who serves 10 months and then his required time is done, who then decides to join the US Marines with the intention of going to Vietnam. Connect those two parts of the story for us.
I think I have to start when I was younger, when I was a teenager, when I was around 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. I went to a private boys' school in Stockholm where my family lived. So I lived at home, but and that school was conservative. It was pro-war. So I was surrounded by kids who came from conservative families, most of them, and they were pro-war because World War II was a big issue, and most of them were luckily pro-Allied, pro-US, pro-Britain. My father was a highly successful professional in his field, and during the war, he was very much pro-Allied, and he served for a short term in the Swedish Defense Forces. Maybe the most important book that influenced me, and that is Those Devils in Baggy Pants. And that's a book written by a American airborne soldier who was in the 82nd Airborne, who survived all, 2 years of combat in Europe. And that book was a very pro-American, pro-US Army book, and I think it influenced me subconsciously. I was a loser in many ways. My father was very successful. I was the opposite. I was a loser. I dropped out of high school. I had no aims in life. I had no future. And I started working as an underground miner in different mines in Sweden. And then, so now I can hook up with, then I was drafted into the Swedish Army. So having been a loser, all of a sudden, when I'm drafted into the Swedish Army and I'm serving there for 10 months, and from day one, I realized that I'm one of the best guys in my platoon. My platoon commander was an airborne young lieutenant, and he was super gung ho, and I really liked him. And he liked me. I turned out to be the best marksman in my platoon. I turned out to be like the top soldier in his platoon. I became his favorite soldier, and I really, before you know it, I loved the military life because for the first time in my life, I was the best at something. Before that, I had been the worst at something. I dropped out of high school. I had no future. I had no aim in life. And at the same time, of course, I read the newspapers, I watch television, and I know there is a war going on. At that time, the ground war, when the Marines landing in March 65, happens actually when, more or less when I'm being drafted into the Swedish Army. So I'm reading about now the ground war has started in Vietnam. When the ground war in Vietnam had all of a sudden in a little over a year had grown tremendously. From a few thousand Marines in March 65, you now had 100,000 Marines and Army troops, and more are going to be on the way. So I knew there was a war going on in Vietnam, and I cannot really pinpoint a specific reason, but I made a decision in April 1966 that I'm going to fight in Vietnam. I'm discharged. I immediately go to the US Embassy in Stockholm. And this is way before we had the security measures we now have. You just enter the building, you ask the secretary, can I see one of your military air chairs? Sure. I walked down the corridor, knocked on the door, and it was the office of an Army colonel, a US Army colonel. And I sat down at his desk and I explained who I was and that I want to fight in Vietnam. And his response was incredible. He said, I love guys like you. You want to go to fight in Vietnam? I'm all for you. Go and fight. We need guys like you. And here I am, a Swedish civilian in Stockholm, in Sweden. And this military attaché colonel tells me to go. And, I'm super gung ho. Then I lived with my parents at that time. And I go home to our apartment. And I tell my parents, I'm going to fight in Vietnam. My parents almost faint. They are shocked.
Yeah.
My mother almost collapses. My father pulls some strings, and he does it very quickly. And he finds me a very exciting job in West Africa to work in the wilderness of the rainforest, mountainous rainforest, in the totally unknown, pretty wild West Africa, prospecting for iron ore. And I accept that job. I think it's great, but I still have this thought of going to Vietnam, still very, very anchored in my brain. So I fly to Africa. I live this sort of colonial type lifestyle with the natives carrying everything on their heads. And I and these 5 to 10 year older young Swedish geologists, we are exploring and are constantly looking for minerals in the rainforest of the tropical part of West Africa. And we have a great life. I have a great life. I still have this strong desire to go to fight in Vietnam. And now the war has gotten even bigger. Now it is 1967, and the war is just mushrooming. And they think I'm crazy. These Swedish guys, you're crazy. Please do not go to Vietnam. It's crazy. You will be killed. And I now have to mention something very, very important. When I made my decision in 1966 to fight in Vietnam, I knew deep in my heart I would not be killed. I would not be seriously wounded. Because if I ever had that thought, I would have dropped my thoughts of going to Vietnam. If I thought, well, I may get killed, I may get my legs blown off. If I had had that thought, I would never have gone to Vietnam. In March or April 1967, when I worked about 8 months in Africa, I traveled to the capital of this country called Liberia, where we are working. And I go to the US Embassy and I apply for an immigrant visa. And it turns out to be extremely easy at that time in 1967 to get a visa. It was like a piece of cake. So even though the paperwork took some time, but to get the actual visa was extremely easy. So in May 1967, I have all the papers to enter the US. I did it purely for adventure. For example, let's say at that time, when I was in the Swedish Army, there was a British war. There was no war in Southeast Asia, but there was a British war in Africa. I would have tried to join the Brits to fight in this war in Africa. In other words, any war would have been good for me. It was the Vietnam War, just by coincidence, there was the Vietnam War. It coincided with my personal development and trying to break out from this sort of negative life with no success, while my father was the opposite, was extremely successful. Landed JFK, I take a yellow cab, And I'd tell the cab driver, drive to Manhattan, and then could you find me a hotel somewhere in Manhattan? Sure. There's a hotel on 34th Street. And he dropped me at the hotel. I checked in. I went up to my hotel room. This was a very large hotel. In my hotel room were two thick phone books, the yellow pages and the white pages. In the white pages, at the very end of the white pages, were the blue pages. And I leafed through them. And there I found government offices, New York City offices, New York State offices. At the very end, the federal offices. At the very end of the federal office, under you had United States Armed Forces. And then beneath that, recruiting station, Times Square. My hotel was 8 blocks from Times Square. I walked up to Times Square. I found the recruiting station right in the heart, right in the middle of Times Square. It's very visible. And I walked in, and there you had the 4 services, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, and the Army. And I started talking to the Marine recruiter. Then I talked to the Army recruiter, and they both trying to sign me up. And I listened to their selling points. I like both of them, but I lean more towards the Marine because he said, if you join the Marines, you have to sign a 4-year enlistment, but I'm going to give you a special deal. If you sign up for 2 years, I'll take you. I went back a few times. I still lived in this hotel. I had made very good money in Africa, by the way. That's why I could afford all this. After about close to 2 weeks of going back and forth in my mind, who shall I choose? I chose the Marines. And then around the second or third week of the second or third week of June 1967, I decided to join the Marines. So I was told to go down to a building called One Whitehall at the very southern tip of Manhattan. And there, together with dozens of young men, we swore we're going to fight for the U.S. Armed Forces.
You went back to Vietnam in the 1990s. Why did you do that?
War ended in 1975. For immediately through the media and photographs, articles in the newspapers, TV programs, we all over the world, but particularly here in the United States, we started to learn about the devastation of North Vietnam, of South Vietnam. We started to hear the numbers of killed all over, if you include the whole population. And pretty quickly, we started to learn that we have killed as many as 3 million Vietnamese persons, individuals, children, wives, husbands, elderly, soldiers. North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, they have died by the hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And the North Vietnamese already knew that they had 300,000 missing in action in South Vietnam. And all of these numbers and all these photographs and all these facts and the fact that I had been part of that war made me feel compassion for the nation. Initially, I had some guilt feelings for having been part of this very destructive war, but as I said earlier, I didn't go to Vietnam to kill Vietnamese. I went to Vietnam for adventure. To me, the war was adventure, and it was very adventurous. It ended in a nasty way for me, but I survived. So starting already in the 70s, I started to fantasize about going back, but it was unrealistic. I even went to the South Vietnamese embassy in the early 70s, and of course they said, the war was still going on, but I was, of course, denied to visit a visa. But then, seriously, in 1991, went to the embassy and applied for a visitor visa. It took a year before I finally got a visitor visa, and I visited Vietnam for 3 weeks in 1992 in Saigon. Outside Saigon, I saw the South Vietnamese Army's version of their Arlington, and it was an incredibly momentous, beautiful cemetery. It was overgrown because the Vietnamese rulers of Vietnam in 1992, they could care less about the South Vietnamese soldiers. So even though it was very, very impressive and momentous, it was abandoned and overgrown, but you could still see how big it was and how beautiful it must have been and impressive it must have been when the war ended in 1975. And one of the places I want to revisit is Khe Sanh. And I went to Khe Sanh. I had to have a driver, as I said, with a chauffeur, and I had to have a government guide with me because it was illegal to go there without a guide. So I was very, very likely the first Khe Sanh veteran to return to Khe Sanh after the war.
I'm just wondering if you have any recollection of what thoughts you had when you.
Well, I was remembering so much about how hard life, how tough and dangerous life was for us during the siege in 1968, between the 21st of January and sometime towards the end of April, for officially 77 days it lasted.
Is this the occasion when you met the former North Vietnamese officer?
No, that was 2 years later
Oh.
when I went back in 1994. After I'd seen Khe Sanh, I then traveled by train and by airplane, slowly but surely up to Hanoi. And I saw this fascinating capital city where, for example, in one of the big lakes in central Hanoi, in both in 1992 and in 1994, there was a tail of a B-52 that had been shot down and crashed into this lake. I presume the crew had parachuted from the falling B-52 and had become POWs, but the B-52 itself was still in this lake in the center of Hanoi. And that, for me, as a Vietnam veteran, it was quite an incredible, almost bizarre thing to see.
Was that kind of was it still there just I mean, did you have the feeling that it was there almost as a monument?
Yes, it was. It was the Vietnamese politicians and military leaders who decided to keep it there. As you said, it's like a monument of victory. We won over the Americans, and the American crash plane is here. But I also wanted to officially reconcile with Vietnam. And to me, who loved backpacking and mountaineering and who had backpacked a lot in Alaska, in Canada, in northern Sweden, where I was born and raised. For me, to climb Vietnam's tallest mountain would be the ultimate reconciliation. And my dream was to do it with a former enemy, ideally a North Vietnamese Army soldier, veteran, because it was the NVA that had almost managed to kill me, and my platoon had killed a number of them. I managed to establish a friendship with a group of North Vietnamese Army veterans who with the help of an interpreter, we had a good time together. And it was that group of NVAs that helped me to organize my climb up into the interior part of Vietnam. And so now I'm going to try to plan the climbing of Vietnam's tallest mountain, which is actually quite tall. It's 10,300 feet. From the lowest level, which is about 4,100 feet, it's a little over 6,000 vertical feet to climb up a pretty steep mountain. I was introduced to this man who was about my age. I was 50 at that time. and he seemed to be about my age. And we, right then and there in the evening, decided to, yes, tomorrow morning we start a climb. I was well prepared with as far as clothing is concerned. I had no tent, no sleeping bag. I had bought a blanket with me that was going to serve as, instead of a sleeping bag, it would help me to survive the, I presume, very cold nights up on the mountain. So the following morning, we started, and he had everything else that we would need for the climb. We came down into at the bottom of the valley, crossed a bridge over a stream, and then we started up. After about 2 hours of walking uphill along these wet trails, we took a break. We sat down, and I had with me, luckily, a large piece of paper, an 8.5 by 11 piece of clean paper, and I had a lead pencil. I also had my U.S. Army 1 to 50,000 topographic map, which was done by the U.S. military when the Vietnam War was being planned in the early 60s. And they had evidently taken aerial photographs of the whole country of Vietnam, South Vietnam, North Vietnam. So the map, which I had bought from the Library of Congress, was encased in plastic to protect it from water and rain. So it was a perfect place to write notes onto this map. So we started writing notes to each other. I didn't speak a word of Vietnamese. He did not speak a word of English. But with the help of these pens, paper and pencil, and making grimaces, uttering sounds, shaking our heads, nodding our heads, we could communicate. And I found out very quickly that he had been a North Vietnamese army soldier starting in the late 60s and had served first as somebody who humps supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And then he had been trained to become a North Vietnamese soldier, an infantryman. And he had started fighting the Americans in the Central Highlands after I had left Vietnam. This was in the 70s, early 70s. And then when the American troops left Vietnam in 1973, he kept on fighting the South Vietnamese army. And to make a long story short, he then had risen to a junior lieutenant, and he was a tank commander, and he drove into Saigon on the 30th of April, 1975. All that I found out during our first 5-10 minutes of our break, our first break. And I told them then about me. And I managed to, by writing my birth date, I drew a very simple map of the world, of Europe, Scandinavia, and he recognized that I was from Sweden. But I wrote USA, and he recognizes USA as being, United States of America. So he knew I had been a soldier, which I explained. So after about 20 or 30 minutes of, to me, an extremely exciting exchange of information, we both knew that we had been enemies. Even though he had been fighting in other parts, he had actually humping supplies. As a matter of fact, it turns out that he had been humping supplies to supply ammunition and everything else to the North Vietnamese army troops that were surrounding Khe Sanh combat base. I noticed when we started the trip that something about his clothing looked familiar and his backpack looked familiar. But it wasn't until later on during the climb that I recognized his MBA issued backpack and trousers, which I presume he had worn during the war. In 1968, I had seen my share of fallen MBAs, and now I was climbing Phan Xipang with a very ally MVA combat veteran wearing the same uniform, carrying the same backpack as those killed MVAs. So to me, that added a lot to the trip, to our climb of the mountain. He had a blanket, I had a blanket. He, with the help of cutting small bamboo pieces, he made a somewhat flat bed when we spent our first night. We spent 2 nights on the mountain. Our first night, as I said, he made and I together, we made a somewhat smooth bed. We laid one blanket on top of that, and then he, with wood, with his machete, he cut short pieces and made almost like a very simple tent, and he spread plastic over these pieces of wood. And then after we had eaten our dinner, which he cooked in his beaten up aluminum kettle, where we ate with his spoon. We both ate out of, I didn't have my own utensils with me. We ate with his little aluminum spoon, the rice and the other food we had with us. So we shared the food, like we did during the war. We Marines, often we had to share everything, and we slept together. And the same with hanging out. When we spent that night, I hadn't even thought about how we were going to spend the night. But it turns out, because of the cold, it was extremely cold. It was close to freezing up there. We had to sleep literally close together like this, but against crouch. And then we spread that blanket on top of that. We had all our clothes on, my Gore-Tex jacket, my sweater, my long john, my pants, my socks, my shoes, everything to stay warm. So here I'm sleeping together, back to crutch, together with my former enemy. And that was, again, a very strange experience initially, but I quickly got used to it, and I fell asleep. Even I woke up during the night because I had developed in the early 90s spasm in my right leg due to my brain damage. But that, particularly when I came back, that added so much to my experience of climbing this mountain with my former enemy. We certainly had not been brothers in arms, but that night I felt that Hung was my friend. And I think he also felt that I was his friend. I'm pretty sure, even though I must have also had other thoughts about me. I was an American, and I had tried to kill him and kill the Vietnamese population. The Americans bombed Hanoi, bombed all of North Vietnam was bombed. The second night had rained. Both days it rained. But the second day rained even more. And we were soaking wet when we finally came to close to the peak and decided to spend the night there. We made a camp, and then Hung prepared the fire to cook our rice and some other dry food we had with us. But we had no kindling. We had nothing dry. I had with me in my backpack a book, Fortunate Son. I had read about 68 pages. I tore those 68 pages out of the book. It was a paperback. I crumbled them up. I put them in the fire with my first. I had 2 cigarette lighters with me. Heat matches were wet. Hung's matches were wet. And without that fire, if we had not been able to light that fire, we were in bad shape. It's a far-fetched, but we could have frozen to death that night. So it was imperative to start the fire. My first cigarette lighter did not work. I dropped it in the fire. I tried my second lighter. It lit. The paper started to burn. The wood started to burn. Before you know it, we had this wonderful warm fire going. We cooked our food, and then we kept on feeding it with branches. And we had a wonderful evening. And all of a sudden, as we were sitting there, the first lighter, which was full of lighter fuel, exploded as if we were hit by incoming artillery. And we both threw ourselves backwards. After a few seconds, we realized this is not combat. And then we roared. We laughed so much that we roared. We were it was so funny, so crazy, so stupid. We both thought we were back in the Vietnam War. We came back on the 4th day, and I am dead tired. dead tired, extremely tired. Hang seemed to be in much better shape. We go to his house where he lived with his wife and his kids, and his father lives there also. And a picture taken of me by his son using my camera. And to honor him and the climb, I put on his pith helmet, the same helmet that he had worn and the NVAs had worn when they were fighting the Americans and then the South Vietnamese. I could not help but feel that my arduous journey had been more important than its glorified destination. Whether or not Han and I achieved the summit, together we had climbed Fansipan. It was this partnership of mutual trust and sharing that mattered most to me, perhaps to Han as well. Whatever the case, I know that Vietnam is a country, not a war, and that our enemies, then and now, are human beings, just like us.